Hi everyone. I've recently been asked to make a video to talk about which version of the vintage Graflex was used for the props in A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back. So I'm going to try to go over it and make it as simple as possible. I'm not going to talk about the sequel trilogy of Graflex because the video would then be too long and too complicated, and I want to try to keep it as simple and as brief as possible. So we're just going to talk about A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about so far, the vintage Graflex has essentially two versions, or think of it as two generations. The earlier generation is called a Folmer, and that's a reference to the stamping over here. Unfortunately, it's partially covered, but you can clearly see here it says Folmer. It says something like made by the Folmer group, blah blah blah. Right, and there's two different like sub versions of the Folmer. The one with the stamping. There's this one. This particular one does not have a patent number. It just says, I'll try to lift this up. No, it's stuck. I glued this down. Apologies for that, but it says made by the Folmer Group, Corp, something. I forget the exact wording, but there's a New York here somewhere. There's no number anyway. And this is known as the Folmer non-patent. There's a different version that I think came later on called a Folmer with patent. It's very, very similar in the wording on the stamping here, except in the end there's a patent number. So that's the Folmer. The other type of Graflex is called a Graflex Inc. And the difference in the stamping is it doesn't say the word Folmer at all. It just says made by Graflex Inc, etc. And between the Folmer and the Inc, the Folmer is an earlier version, so it is considerably more rare and therefore more expensive. The Inc is a little bit easier to find. They're generally in better condition, and they are generally also more affordable. Having said that, there are small differences in the appearance of the Folmers and the Inks. It's not always easy to tell, and I am no expert, but there are certain features on the body of the flash that can help you differentiate a Folmer from an Ink. Now, that's not the purpose of this video today, because I will do that video in the future when I get my vintage Ink, which I'm waiting for. But what I wanted to discuss today is, did they use a Folmer or an Ink for A New Hope, for ESB, etc.? Okay, so before I get into that, full disclaimer, I'm no expert. So if I say something that you disagree with, that's absolutely fine. Some of my information might be incorrect, but I believe I've sort of researched these things fairly well. There is a lot of debate about this topic. I mean, there are threads with hundreds of pages about people, it's hard to confirm because some of these differences that I mentioned between the Folmer and the Ink are so small that, to be able to confirm that, you need high-res, close-up pictures to the hilt in the movies, which just doesn't exist on those original two movies. So a lot of it is conjecture and theories and kind of assumptions. So I'll do what I can to cover it, but just bear in mind that, none of this is 100% gospel. So without further ado, we'll start with A New Hope. So A New Hope is a little bit simpler because the Graflex only appears in a couple of scenes. There's obviously the first scene, Obi-Wan hands it over to Luke and he's holding it in his hand. And then later on, obviously, he ignites it. Well, the one he ignites is going to be different to the one he hands him. The one he ignites is a stunt saber, so it doesn't even have, I think, the bunny ears. It's different. It's got a blade, it's got a motor. You can actually see, there's a picture of it. You can see something like a wire running down, and Mark Hamill, it's tucked in his sleeve like that, so he can power on the spinning rod. So sorry to ruin the magic, but yeah, that's called, anything with a blade is a stunt saber. And hero sabers are what's either the actors like handling it like that and it's off, or it's hung on the belt. You can see it later on. There's some scenes on Tatooine. Luke has got it hung on his belt. So that's the hero hilt. That's the more sort of like official one. So for the hero, A New Hope, is it a Folmer or is it an Inc? Well, to be honest, no one really knows for certainty, but by far, the most people think it's probably a Folmer. And again, the only way to really tell a Folmer from an Inc is something like this. The rivet on the lever is different. The lever is shaped slightly differently. The pins over here, those brass pins and the socket there, in the Folmer, if you look at this, you can see they're smooth. On an Inc, this is a vintage Inc on the top, they have that step, and that's very typical of an Inc. So yeah, those are a few of the other differences. Like here in the bunny ears, you see that brass rivet there, that's typical of a Folmer. The Inc is a more sort of punched out rivet like that. But you know, you're never gonna see a scene in A New Hope with it zoomed in like that, are you? So you can't really say, oh, it's 100% a Folmer or an Inc. You're not even gonna see the pins very well. These are all such small differences that it is very hard for someone to say, oh, I know for a fact it's a Folmer or an Inc. But most people assume it's probably a Folmer based on, well, we never see the stamping as well. That's obviously the main way to tell them apart is the stamping. But since you don't see the stamping in A New Hope, you don't really see good close-ups of any of these parts that I've talked about, the lever, the pin. But I think there are a couple of pictures in the like behind the scenes, like are black and white, that suggest that the pins here are smooth. Therefore, most people assume it's probably a Folmer of some type. Is it a patent Folmer? Is it a non-patent Folmer? No one knows that. So in conclusion, for A New Hope, honestly, if you can get a nice Inc in a good condition, it's going to save you a lot of money. I think you should just go for it. The Folmer is obviously more sought after because it's more rare, I suppose. So if you want to do a Folmer, you know, that's absolutely fine too. There isn't really a consensus about the A New Hope version, but most people, as I say, assume it's probably a Folmer. Okay, so that's A New Hope. ESB is where it gets a bit more tricky. So the problem with ESB is that there are quite a few hilts used in that movie. What you see with Luke is not the same hilt throughout the whole movie. It's not just one prop. There was at least 3 heroes, and there was many stunts. So what you mean by ESB could be different to what someone else is talking about. The 3 main hero ESB props are in Hoth, Bespin, and Dagobah. So the one in Hoth, again, we see it in the Battle of Hoth on his belt. We see one in the Wampa Cave scene, although that's a stunt saber. That's not a hero hilt. That's a stunt saber, but still, it is a Graflex, obviously. And that's the only one that we can say with 100% certainty because it drops in the snow like that. And if you zoom in, and there are high-res pictures of that, the stamping can clearly be seen. And it's oriented exactly like this. And there's no mistaking the New York. So because of the New York stamping, it can only be a Folmer non-patent. The Folmer with patent does not have the word New York, like I think it has NY, and the Inc doesn't have it either. So Folmer non-patent for at least the Wampa Cave scene, probably all of the Hoth scenes too, a Folmer non-pattern. Um, what else? Dagobah is different. Dagobah even looks different. The red button is missing from here. This is one of the grips is like crooked. There's all sorts of differences here. But what they found was that they compared the bottom portion of it. There's some scratches on it and that crooked grip. That was used later on the Ranch Saber, the one that's in the Ranch, and that exists today. But not the top half. The top half has like a texture tape and is different from Dagobah, but the bottom part is definitely the exact same bottom half that was in Dagobah. Now, there are good pictures of that stamping, and that is a Folmer with patent. It's got the patent number, so not the same as Hoth. Hoth is Folmer with no patent, or patent, and Dagobah is Folmer with the patent number. And that's the difference. As for the top half of the Dagobah, the top half of the Hoth, again, no one really knows. There aren't any good pictures of the pins, but probably, you know, it's probably a Folmer of some sort again. So again, it's up to you if you can find it. I mean, this is an ink. This top half of mine is a vintage ink, right? So the differences are just so subtle. It's really just like the pins, as I mentioned, inside the bunny ears. You know, there aren't much differences here on the top. The clamp lever, that's clearly different. Compare that to, excuse me, over here. That's a Folmer rivet. It's like a smaller, rusty pin. That one is a more of a like a round machined. And the shape of the lever is different. But again, you know, there aren't very good clear pictures of this prop on any of those scenes. Finally is Bespin, which is the scene that most people associate with like the Hero ESB Graflex. And we can see a very clear shot of that. It's hanging on Mark Hamill's belt when like R2-D2 like comes and bumps against him. There's a really good picture of that. It's nice and clear. From that, we can see that the pins are smooth. So again, it's more or most likely to be a Folmer of some sort. Folmer, whether it's patent or non-patent, again, no one knows. We don't see the stamping clearly, but it's probably a Folmer. But as I'm saying that, it's not 100% because these parts, you know, obviously this comes apart. So it could have been a top Folmer and everything from down here could have been like an ink or anything really. And we see that in The Force Awakens. In The Force Awakens, they used vintage for the whole build, but the top is very clearly a Folmer. I won't go into that, but it's 100% a Folmer on The Force Awakens. But then from here on down, it's 100% an ink, and the stamping is seen. So, you know, during production, they sometimes, I mean, if these parts have like become damaged during filming, don't forget that these were like taken to like Norway for filming and in the swamps on the sets for Dagobah. So some of these parts might have got corroded or damaged. So they could easily have like disassembled that, kept the top half, and just put like a lower portion of a different Graflex on it. So what you're seeing in Bespin could easily be a Folmer up here and an ink or anything else down there. So there's really no way to 100% tell. Yeah, I'm sorry this isn't anything that helpful, but this is all the information we have as of now. There really isn't anything that's 100% confirmed other than what I've mentioned, the Hoth one. And the Hoth, the bottom at least, for sure, is a Folmer without patent. The Dagobah is a Folmer with patent. And honestly, everything else is up to you. As I say, there are some things like smooth pins and so on that suggest they're all Folmers, but that is not 100% certain. And if you find a beautiful ink and it's going to save you some money, I would say just go for it. Don't worry too much about that because there's no confirmation about the original trilogy Graflexes at all. Hope this was helpful. I hope it wasn't like too overwhelming. I know I rambled on a bit, But if you have any questions, feel free to ask. If you're interested, I could do like a part 2 video about the sequel trilogy Graflexes. Otherwise, I think we'll just leave it at that. Thanks a lot for watching, and see you in the next one.